Welcome, friends, to this Ventures course, one in a series of really great content that we've been able to share with you. And thanks to McPherson College for sponsoring this whole series and helping all of this be a reality. My name is Enton Eller, and I have the privilege of being the technical host for these series. And so I want to welcome each of you and perhaps a few more and remind you this meeting is being recorded, and we share these recordings so that I'll send the link to you for you to access them, as well as we can then make this content available for others as well. Please remember to check out our other offerings if this is something that you have enjoyed, and come back not only for what we have coming up, but also feel free to look back through our archives and to see all of the courses we've done for the last 8 or more years, because there are some really good things there. But without further ado, I want to introduce our presenter for this evening and tomorrow, Greg Davidson Laszakovits. And Greg, I'm glad you're here. And let me just share this short bio with all of us. Greg has written as a trusted coach, speaker, and leader. He gives his best so that others can share theirs. He has an executive leadership certificate from Cornell University and a master's degree in conflict transformation. After 25 plus years of experience in the for-profit and not-profit worlds, that experience taught Greg what focused and purposeful leadership looks like. And his ongoing journey as a partner in racial justice teaches him daily that transformation is possible and that we all must keep growing. And so for our course today, Greg, if you want to say any more than that by way of introduction or launch us in, I just want to turn it over to you and say, I'm so glad you're here, and we're looking forward to all that you're going to share with us. Thank you.
Thanks, Enton. Really appreciate that. So that's my sort of generic intro, which sounds a little stilted and formal for this group. I know a lot of you, and I know a lot of you know me through Church of the Brethren circles. So I'll give you my Church of the Brethren bio a little bit, so you know kind of how I connect to congregations, especially. I grew up in the Phoenix First Church of the Brethren, now Papago Buttes. We have Papago Buttes pastor with us tonight. We're really glad to see John. So John is pastoring the congregation that I grew up in out in Phoenix. And after growing up there, I went into Brethren Volunteer Service, and I directed work camps, youth and young adult work camps out of our general offices in Elgin. And then from there went to Bethany Seminary, where I studied. I got an MDiv, and then had a Peace Studies emphasis as well. Following that, went to work for the Brethren Witness Office, and I was doing anti-racism training in the denomination for a little over a year. After which I went and worked in the Church of the Brethren Washington office for 3 years, and then went to Brazil, where I worked with Church of the Brethren Starts in Brazil for a couple of years with my wife Karen, and our newborn Ellen at the time. Ellen is now in her freshman year at Virginia Commonwealth, so it gives you an idea how long ago that was. From Brazil, I went to the Elizabethtown Church of the Brethren, where I was pastor for about 15 years. And then in COVID days, as we know them, I made a shift. I shifted over and I started working for a leadership institute called Initiative One. And I was a facilitator for Initiative One, and also doing some of their change leadership for racial justice work. And then I did that for a little while, and then I decided, hey, it would be probably even more rewarding to do that kind of work, but do it for whom I wanted to do it, including churches, because that was not a lot of church work. So I started my own company called GDL Insight almost 2 years ago now. And I just have the privilege of walking alongside a lot of different people and a lot of different organizations, and it's congregations, it's businesses, some small businesses, some medium-sized businesses, actually even some governmental organizations. I do that. And so the stuff that I'm reviewing tonight is really something that I would teach and I would use whether I was in a congregational setting or in a business setting. And you'll see a little bit more as we go on. You'll see kind of how it can relate to both. So it's great to be here with you all. I have a tremendous amount of respect and admiration for everything that you do in your congregations. I know that some of you are pastors. I know that some of you are lay people, but regardless, our congregations need leadership, and they need leadership. I don't think it's hyperbole to say now more than ever. And we'll talk about that in just a little bit. So my goal tonight and tomorrow night, and we're going to get through as much as we can, right? I think my style is very much, I hope this is maybe even the longest monologue you might hear from me. Probably not, but I really want to have a lot of to and fro. And so there may be points, or there will be points when I would encourage you to just go ahead and come off of mute if you have TVs and everything else off behind you, because it'll pick up that background noise if you have other stuff on behind you. But I want it to be as much of a roundtable discussion as we can get. There will be opportunities then when you'll break into small groups and answer some questions, so you have a little bit more opportunity to sort of strategize with one another and think through some of these things with one another. But that's really the way I want to go about it tonight. And we'll get through what we can. My goal is that you have something, even after tonight, that's a real takeaway, something that you can take with you. I'll have a handout that Enton or I can email you, and you can have something to go off of, so you're not going to walk away empty-handed. You'll have something to continue to remember some of the stuff that we're talking about tonight. So thank you for being here. The other thing I just wanted to mention is, this is going to be recorded. There will be the opportunities, though, in your small groups, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, Enton, but there will be an air of confidentiality that I would love to hold in these sessions. Again, even though I know that this will be up on YouTube and other places, I also want it to be kind of a real workshop place where we can talk about what's going on in the life of our congregations. I know that you all would do that respectfully, of course, but just, I wouldn't want a situation where we say, well, what's going on in such and such congregation. We'll all hold that in a spirit of mutual care and support for one another. I'm sure that's what you all bring to it, but just a reminder that that's something we want to do. Yeah, go ahead, Enton.
And I'll add that the small group breakouts will not be recorded or appear on a recording. So as we go into those breakout sessions, remember that anything that you share there within a small group as you get to nitty-gritty is not going to be captured anywhere by us.
Excellent. Thanks, Enton. And just a note that you all saw how Enton put his hand up. And if you have a question at any point, just go ahead and put your hand up, or you can click the reaction button and put your hand up. Again, I want this to be as interactive as possible. So go ahead and if you were hoping you could just sit there and just take it all in, sorry, I might call on you a time or two, but I'm sure you can all do it. Okay, so positive strategies for positive organizational change. And in this conversation, I would think about this as positive congregational change, right? So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to share my screen. Let me know how this is looking, and we'll go from there. So does this look all right? Everybody can see the screen?
Looks good.
Looks good. Thank you. Yeah, you know that I couldn't see you as well. So that's great.
Greg, we're seeing the presenter view and not
okay. That's good to know. Let me try that again. I wonder why that is. Let's see here. Thanks, Enton. How about that?
There you go.
Excellent. Okay. So blah, 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 blah. Enough about me. This is one of my favorite quotes. So the only place we cannot expect change is from a vending machine. And I love this quote because the quote itself is really fascinating, because some of us remember what it was like with those machines on the left, right? Where it only took change right? I'm guessing most of you on the screen remember those times when when's the last time you had to do this? Does anybody have change for a dollar, right? Can anybody break this dollar so that I can go ahead and I can get my soda, right? Anybody remember those times? Yes, no, maybe? And then it was a really big deal. I don't know if you remember this then, when those machines on the right came in, and they had that, you could see there, if you look closely, you could see where it takes the dollar bill. And now we could feed our dollar bills and we didn't have to ask for change anymore. So even vending machines themselves have changed, and showing how change is just an ever-flowing, nonstop kind of thing. Now, if you might come across a vending machine like this. I don't know if they have these in your area, but now you can purchase your soda, your snack, or whatever with a credit card. And some of them don't even take actual currency anymore, right? Like physical currency. You can't put a dollar bill in there. You can't put change in there anymore. You have to go to the electronic form of payment. And so I love that quote, because it's in itself, it's showing that change and not stability is the norm in life, right? And so if we don't adapt to the changes that are happening around us, our organizations, I'll put it very bluntly, our organizations, our congregations are not going to survive. And that's not me saying that we got to go cashless, and that's not me saying that we have to get very highly technological. That is me saying, though, that we have to continue to adapt to what's going on in the world around us, because that's the way it's always been, right? That's the story. I think that's the story of the gospel. That's the story of the Bible, and it's certainly been the story of the Church of the Brethren as we've continued to adapt as the years progress and move on. And so another way to say it is that either we handle change or change is going to handle us. All right. So tonight we're going to talk about a strategy, at least one, for that change. So let's talk about some of the changes that have happened just in the last 10 years. Okay. And this is an opportunity for you to chime in if I'm missing some. So I'm just going to roll through some of the things that have changed in the last 10 years. So cell phone ownership. Cell phone ownership has gone from 35% to 85% in the last 10 years. Okay. And then, so that's a big deal in and of itself, that we now have phones with us all the time. I was explaining to my son the other day that there was a time when we went skiing, and there was a time when you would have to say very clearly, I'm going to meet you at X o'clock at this very particular place. And you hoped that you'd be able to meet at that place and that time. Now, that blew his mind, because now we just call, hey, where are you? What's going on? Oh, okay, I'm over here by this thing. I'll meet you there, right? So cell phones have not only changed because we have instant communication in our pocket, but the fact that they're little computers. And so now it's changed the very nature of how our world is working around us. So some of the things that I just off the top of my head thinking about that, like the gig economy, right? Taxis. When's the last time, or how many taxi cab companies are there around these days? Cell phones enabled an entirely new industry to open up in ride sharing, like Uber and Lyft, right? Others too. So you think about social media as well, the ways in which we communicate, the ways in which we share information with one another. Again, no value judgment, whether this is good or bad. It's just a big change. So you think about these changes that have gone on. Working from home is now possible thanks to technology. Cyber schooling is now possible thanks to technology. It's changing the entire, in our area, it's changing the entire landscape of how education is delivered. Moving away from technology, there's a mental health crisis in youth in our country right now. Statistics have shown that. And again, it's not about saying, I'm not interested in necessarily tonight why that's happening, but just note that it's happening. And so it's a major dynamic that is shifting how we do everything. We see LGBTQ plus inclusion rising in our country and even in our denomination. That's part of how the world is changing. I would say for the plus, some might disagree, but nevertheless, whether you agree or disagree, that's part of the nature of what's going on. We see a wealth gap increasing in the country. So money is being consecrated, our wealth is being concentrated in the hands of fewer and fewer people. So it's changing the ways that our economy works. And we can even think about that. It's maybe for another time, but I've been doing, I do a fair bit of consulting with congregations on a wide variety of issues. And it's been really interesting to look at some analysis of how giving is changing in congregations, because they're seeing that in congregations itself. You sometimes have fewer and fewer people who are gifting more and more money to the congregation, even as the total number of quote unquote giving units are decreasing. So a congregation, I see congregations who are staying the same in terms of their overall giving amount, but the number of people who give is going down as some give more and they're able to give more. We see increased political polarization in our country, just to point to a pretty obvious change there. And we see the impacts of climate change that's impacting our world. So if y'all weren't on earlier, we were talking about the weather, and it's just changing the way in which and the ways in which we tend to operate. So there are these big changes that are happening in the world. So let's think about some of the changes that are happening in congregations. And this is where I'm curious, I would love to hear some of your input as you are interacting with your congregations. So what are some changes in church life that you've seen in the last 10 years or so? And I'm just gonna stop talking for a moment. I would love to hear the changes that you are seeing in church life.
Alice, I see your hand. Why don't you go ahead?
We have a half-time pastor for the first time in my life, and I haven't been there my whole life, but I'm 75, so this is the first time I've ever had a half-time pastor in any church that I belong to in Des Moines, Ankeny, or at Ivester in Iowa.
Thank you. And what does that mean for the life of the congregation? Are there other changes that are associated with that change?
We don't know.
Oh, yet to be seen.
We've been in this pattern for a while, but the hire was just made official.
Okay. Okay, great. Thank you. Who else? What are some other changes that are happening?
This is Annalisa. I am a pastor with Beacon Heights in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And something I've noticed, especially in the city churches, but also in the country churches that I've pastored, is that so many people's families, next generations, live somewhere else. And so weekends become a competition between, do I do something with my church family, or do I do something with my family of origin, bio family, in a way that wasn't as pressing even when I was a kid, which wasn't that long ago in the life of the church. But when I was a kid, it felt like a lot more of our relatives were just in the same place. And so our church family and our bio family overlapped a lot more.
That is good. That's a really good observation. So it impacts how people attend worship. Yeah. Go ahead, Bill.
We're finding that our midweek common meal fellowship Christian education time has a larger attendance than our Sunday morning.
Wow.
Families are coming with their kids and they don't show up on Sunday morning for that.
Huh. How do you all view that? Positive, negative?
Depends who you talk to. I think it's a positive. At least they're showing up, and we're educating probably 20 to 30 kids in our Sunday school curriculum. I guess you don't call it Sunday school anymore, but I see it as a plus. And it's intergenerational.
Thank you. That's a great share.
Greg, if I might suggest, why don't we stop the screen share and we'll be able to see each other and converse a little better.
Okay. Yeah, what other changes are you all seeing?
Well, in my very small congregation in Springfield, Oregon, we used to have some families with children, It's been quite a few years since we've had any children at all, or young people.
Okay. Thank you for sharing. Colleen, did you have your hand up?
Yes, I did. I was going to say fewer intergenerational activities.
Hmm.
Bill, I see you again, and then I think Monica had her hand up. Go ahead, Bill.
Well, we just made a physical change in our sanctuary, taking out 3 pews so we could create a play area for families during worship time.
Huh.
That went over pretty well, I think.
Okay.
A few grumbling, but I think most people appreciate it. And it's fun to see the kids there.
Yeah. Sometimes I think there's some landmines under those pews, right? They change like that in the sanctuary. Thanks. Monica?
There's just a change in attendance in general, generally down or lower. And that didn't just happen in the last 10 years, but it has accelerated. And even our family is now connected with some other local families doing a house church. So I think, I mean, I say that change, but certainly for the institutional established congregations, a lot are seeing less people in the pews and less people to take on leadership roles.
So it impacts the entire administration of how the church operates a lot of times. Yeah. Excellent sharing. Yeah, go ahead, Catherine.
It used to be, I think, that when people retired, they retired at 65 and they hung around, they took trips, they went to see their kids, but in general, their efforts and their hanging around was dedicated to the church. And now people are sometimes taking a first retirement, taking some time off, and then sometimes they're going back, you know, doing jobs like you're doing, creating their own spaces. And they're oftentimes volunteering for huge amounts of time elsewhere in agencies that are doing amazing things. We have couples who, you know, go for 3 months at a time, 6 months at a time, a year at a time, whereas their efforts would have been dumped into the congregation 10 years ago. Their efforts are now, it's wonderful stuff, but it's not concentrated at the home congregation.
Interesting. Sharon.
We've COVID made some changes in our congregation, and where we began to have a camera and people would join us online, and we're still doing that. Right now it's Facebook, something with Facebook. I'm not sure. I don't have to deal with the electronics. So, but some have not come back in person, but there are quite a few that watch online. And that's been kind of an increase in the congregation in that way. But also, the last number of years, we have become a more outgoing congregation, and giving money to the school lunch program, or different things in the community that need to be done. We're a country church, Fairview Church of the Brethren, and in Iowa, and but a much more giving attitude among the people. When somebody needs some help, people want to help in some way, whether it's financial or food. We are getting food from the Iowa, can't think of the name of it, Feed the Hungry type thing. We get a load of food once a month, divide it up, and have, I think last count was 70 some families picking up food and giving away, and just more giving in their attitudes. And it is a blessing.
Yeah, that's neat to hear the way that COVID has impacted you all to the positive. Another major shift we're seeing in congregational life post-COVID is that the nature of congregations is changing, because there are still people who prefer to attend, quote unquote, worship virtually, whether that's live, whether that's after the fact. And so it's forcing us to ask some interesting questions about what does it mean to be a congregation, and what does it mean to be a congregation where many congregations, small and large, now have had this beautiful benefit of members who did move away, like in the same vein as you were talking about, Annalisa, but they have members who can now keep in better touch with the church even when they are across the country, and some of them there permanently. So it's really a fascinating dynamic. Alice, you had a comment.
Yes, we have a fifth Sunday service Sunday. So it varies from month to month, but has a fifth Sunday. One time we helped the local, it's a warehouse that has clothing and furniture and other things for needy people in the community. We helped organize that. The next one we're going to do probably is put together health kits for the church world service.
Excellent. Excellent.
I saw Majeska's hand as well. Majeska, do you still want to share? You're still muted though, Majeska, so.
I just wanted to make sure we mentioned hybrid services, but that got covered.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody. That is fantastic. I appreciate the feedback. I'm going to share screen again as we progress here. Some of the change you all brought up a lot. A couple more that may or may not have been mentioned is attendance total numbers. We know that total numbers are going down. We know that's happening in the Church of the Brethren. I did last year. I did a sort of a complete analysis of congregational attendance, and we can see that it's a pretty steady decline, and not unlike other mainline Protestant churches. We pretty much mirror those patterns. Something that was brought up too is the attendance patterns of folks and how people tend to think about themselves as we have people now who will attend worship 12 times a year, so once a month basically, but they would absolutely say, yes, that is my home congregation. That is where I belong, and they belong to me. And that's just the way it is. A lot of them are shocked when they realize that they only attend 12 times a year, but they attend when they care to and when they can, and that's their congregation. So it's just a reality. We talked about COVID changes and it's a virtual church, reduced participation. We didn't mention that some of the friction that still exists in congregations. And it's sort of nice that most of that friction that we had even within the congregations about should we mask, should we not mask, should we go virtual, should we have a hybrid, those things have mostly worked themselves out from what I've seen in congregations. But there's still some friction sometimes in some. Just name it. We'll just put it on the table. There are congregations in the Church of the Brethren who are leaving. So that's part of our reality right now. It's a big change in church life. And we've seen this movement to mega churches as well. We might be seeing a movement away from mega churches. Now, some studies recently have shown that might be shifting a little bit. Again, not to judge is this good or is this bad, but just to name some of the changes that are happening. A big one, as far as I'm concerned, is the public perception of religion and clergy in particular is declining. The place that sort of the church, quote unquote, has in the world is declining. I saw a study recently, I mentioned it there, that it was a study that was asking what your trust level was in a variety of occupations. And pastors were only trusted at a high degree or a very high degree by 34% of people. So as somebody who's a pastor, this is really discouraging. You know, 1 in 3 people I meet on the street, if I say I'm a pastor, they're going to have a high degree of trust in me. Anybody know or have a guess what the number one highly respected profession was? COVID is a hint. Nurses were the most highly trusted in this study at 80%.
Let's hear it for nurses.
Yeah. Go nurses. Yeah. So let's think about, so we got all this change going on and we know it's going on. So I just quickly, what are some of the responses that we can have to change? I'm going to take the share off again. What are some of the responses to this change? We have these changes going on. How can we respond to this? I see basically three options. What are the options we have? Go ahead, Alice.
We have no longer enough children to attend Sunday school in person, so we have activities for them to do during church because they don't get up early enough to come to Sunday school.
Right.
You know, you could do the opposite, have Sunday school after, but then we also have a potluck after worship.
Okay. So yeah, and I could have been more clear in my question. What you're naming is a possible response to these changes is to acknowledge the change and do something about it and to adapt to that change, which is what we're really going to be about in this session, right? Another possibility is to just to pretend like it doesn't exist, right? There are congregations out there, believe it or not, who would look at all that list of changes that we just mentioned, all the changes that you all just recited, and they would say, change? What are you talking about? Or they just pretend like it doesn't exist, right? They know that it's going on, but we're just going to pretend like that's over there, and we're just going to do business as usual because we're not sure what else to do. Another response, so you've got engage it, you've got ignore it, and I think the third one is really to acknowledge it, but say that it doesn't matter. And there are a healthy number of congregations that are doing that too. Like the world is changing, and so one of the responses to that is people really sort of put up the walls in figurative ways and say we're just going to do our thing here, and we're not going to worry about what's going on in the world out there. Some, you know, this is a brethren crowd, right? So you understand brethren theology, and you know that some would even say that, well, this is part of who we are as brethren. I've actually heard this, right? I've heard people say, this is just part of who we are as brethren. We're in the world, but not of the world. And so they really kind of close ranks in a way that really sort of pretends or wants to pretend like the world is not having an impact on what's going on around them. The problem with that, as I've seen it, or the sort of hypocrisy, is that what they've really done is frozen a 1950s or a 1960s model. They haven't really closed ranks around a particular theological model. They've just closed ranks around a particular moment in time, usually a nostalgic moment that they felt like when times were good. So that's what we tend to do with change. So I'm going to shift gears. Any comments before I shift gears? Because I want to share with you a story in just a moment, and then we're going to look at the first model for change. So anything before we move on to that? Any questions that you all have? Any comments you want to get in before we shift that gear? Okay, let's do it. All right, so catching up with my slides here. Pretend it doesn't exist, acknowledge it, or engage it. This is Marisa. Marisa is a Church of the Brethren woman who lives in Brazil. Marisa.
I'm not seeing a screen share if you.
Oh, I'm sorry. There we go.
Perfect. Thanks.
My fault. Thank you, Monica. I appreciate it. This is so you're like, this is not Marisa. This is Greg. This is Marisa. Marisa is a Church of the Brethren woman in Brazil, and when I think about somebody who embraces change, when I think about somebody who understands the dynamics of the community in which she lives and works, I think of Marisa. So Marisa, I got to know Marisa. I mentioned earlier that my wife Karen and I lived in Brazil for a number of years, and we were working with new church starts there. Marisa was at one of our sort of ministry / preaching points in a favela. And a favela, if you don't know, is a Brazilian, a lot of people would call it a slum or a ghetto. But they're technically speaking, they're unorganized, meaning they're not sanctioned by a city, places where people live. And so people will gather together. They will organize it. They'll plot out roads. They'll even get electricity strung up by the electric company, because the electric company sees it as a money-making opportunity, of course, somebody they can sell electricity to. And the problem with favelas is oftentimes they're essentially run by the crime bosses, by organized crime in the area. And so Marisa grew up in a favela, and she beat the odds. Marisa beat the odds, and she ended up getting her high school diploma, which is a rarity in favelas. And so she got her high school diploma. And for Marisa, what this meant was a ticket out. For Marisa, this was a way in which she could seek higher and better economic opportunity. It was a way that she could get away from the drugs and the crime in the favela. But Marisa made a different choice. Marisa decided that she was going to go back to the favela, not the one she grew up in, but a different one. And she was going to work with people in the favela. And so her goal was really pretty simple. Her goal was to get kids an education. She realized how valuable and how many doors her education had opened up for her. And so she wanted to go back to a favela and get kids to the point where she could teach them and where they could get an education, hopefully the equivalent of a high school degree. So you can see Marisa has a beautiful smile, full of energy. But Marisa wasn't just going to go back. Marisa developed this plan. And Marisa's plan, simply put, was she was going to go back to the favela. This was with Church of the Brethren support, which I think is notable, especially for you all in this group. She's going to go back with Church of the Brethren support, and she was going to start small. And so this is what she did. Marisa first she just picked a street. She went to one street, and while there, she just started to get to know the kids on the street. Because in most favelas, and this one in particular, the percentage of kids in the favela is very high. And so just on one street, there was probably 20 kids. And so she just started playing games with them. She just played games with them. After school, she knew when they were coming and going to school. She started saying hi. She started getting to know them. And she started playing games with them. And then she started to sneak in like little educational stuff into the games to make them sort of fun. But then also she was sneaking in some math on them and doing some of that kind of stuff. And eventually she got to the point where she rented a home there. And on the first floor of their home, it was designed to be kind of a small shop or store. And so it had a big open area on the first floor. And what she did was she was able to get some little desks. She put the desks in there, and she started to do after school tutoring. And then she realized that the moms didn't have much to do, and the moms had not been educated on that street. So she started to do some basic classes for them. She started to do a microloan project with them. And all this kept driving towards this overall goal that she had of, bringing education and bringing opportunity to folks. This was her ministry. And so we started to do microloan projects. My wife and I, Karen and I, were lucky enough to work with Marisa. We were sort of partnering with her in this ministry. And so we had an up close and personal look at everything that Marisa was doing. And it was awesome. So Marisa was doing this, and just to give you an idea, just another story within the story. One of these kids here, his name is Danilo. By the way, that's my daughter, that's the freshman in college now. So again, a little time capsule here. So Brazilians love kids, which is a beautiful thing in and of itself. Even men and young men, like you see here, love to hold babies, love to take care of kids and play with kids. So Danilo's in this picture, and Danilo was one of these kids who was just, he had like this contagious enthusiasm. He has charisma. I think it's probably the best way to say it. Danilo has this charisma about him. But Danilo, what happens in favelas is that typically when a kid, especially a charismatic kid or a gifted kid, gets of a certain age, he'll get tapped. He'll get shoulder tapped by the organized crime in the area. Hey, you know what? You could make money doing this. Or if you're a spotter on the roof here, you could do that. Or maybe start running some stuff for us. And so Danilo, Marisa knew she had like kind of a time frame with Danilo. And so she was always trying to figure out ways to engage Danilo. And I remember one time And this is really the story, right? This is what I want you to remember as we start to think about what it is to create change in organizations and change in our community and do it positively. So Danilo's birthday was coming up, but there was not a lot of money. You know, Brazilians like to celebrate birthdays like we do with a cake and with singing. Their happy birthday is way better than ours, but nevertheless, they like to have cakes. And so there wasn't just extra cash laying around for Marisa to go and get a cake. And so what she did was she had this idea. And her idea was this. She went from door to door along the street there that she had this ministry. She went from door to door and she basically said, hey, Danilo's birthday, and everybody knew Danilo, right? This was a street. She said, hey, Danilo's birthday is coming up. And Danilo came from a very difficult family. His father was essentially a day laborer. His shovel and his wheelbarrow were literally the tools of his trade. And when he had work, it was a great day. And when he didn't, Danilo and his brothers and sisters wouldn't have much to eat. And his mom was lost to addiction. And so Marisa knew that Danilo wasn't going to have a cake otherwise. So she goes door to door and she says, hey, can you spare a cup of sugar? Hey, can you spare a little bit of flour, an egg, you know, and so on. And so this is how Marisa gathers the materials to bake this cake for Danilo. So and this was one of the most beautiful gospel moments I think that I've ever been part of in my life. We got to be there. So when the cake was delivered, Marisa said this. Marisa said, okay, Greg, here's what's going to happen. You are going to, when I give you the nod at the end of I'm going to stop the sharing. When I give you the nod at the end of the tutorial, at the end of the tutoring for the day, I want you to go up and it was kind of sneak up the back stairs, go to the kitchen where the cake was, and I want you to bring the cake down and kind of bring it around the back way. And so everything was done, and Marisa gave me the nod. I go up and I get the cake. And I bring it around the back way. And so Marisa says, okay, everybody, I don't know if you know, it's a special day. It's Danilo's birthday. And everybody's like, yeah. Parabéns a você. I know, everybody starts singing. Beautiful moment. And then I got to walk in with this cake and Danilo just starts sobbing, like tears of joy. He's got this magnificent smile on his face and everybody is singing and clapping. And then everybody was kind of like Brazilian version of speech. So Danilo has the opportunity to just share a little bit, just thanks. And he's crying. I'm crying too. It was just a beautiful moment. But then as I think back on it, it was a beautiful moment. It was a moment where certainly, God was at work, but it was also a moment when I look back on it now, I say, wow, what Marisa did. Right? With God, hand in hand. Like thinking about how she went about creating not just this moment, but this community. Okay, not just a cake, but notice what she did to make the cake. Like fine, you go to a store, you buy a cake, that's great. But what she did was genius in a way. And I don't know if she knew she was doing this, but she engaged the entire block in doing this. And then, of course, like when everybody starts singing and clapping, the neighborhood gathers round too, right? Because it's echoing throughout the streets. And so everybody's gathering around and getting to be part of this moment. And it got me to thinking about how you go about making change and the intentionality that Marisa had, right? So her intentionality was kids need education. And if they have education, then they'll have these additional opportunities. And so that was she had this very serious and intentional focal point. And then she started thinking about how she could draw people in one by one. She started thinking about how she could start small and get bigger. Okay? So I want you to hold that thought in your head. And we're going to go into some small groups. And I know we're about halfway done with our time here, right? So what I'm going to propose is this, like could we do both small groups and if you need a little bit of a break, right? Because Anton and I talked about, hey, we'll do a short break. What I want to propose is that we take some time for these small groups And what I want you to do, and Ensign is going to what he's going to post the questions in the chat. But the questions are this: as you think about your congregation now, I want you to think about, where do you need to move your congregation in the next 3 to 5 years? As you think about positive change in your congregation and how that gets done, right? We've all seen negative change practiced, right? We've seen heavy-handed, like, you're going to do this and you're going to like it. We've seen that at work. Sometimes we've seen that in congregations. We've seen it in congregations where it's not communicated well. We've seen it in congregations where somebody mentions it and then you get this whiplash response to it. That's why I was kind of joking about the landmines under the pews, right? Because congregations have been doing this for years. When I work with businesses, I tell them that change is easy to do in a business because I've had practice doing it in a congregation. And I'm sort of joking, but I'm not joking, right? So when you think about congregations and the dynamics that are there, we have to be super intentional about how we go about change, because you've got decades, you've got generations of habits, of patterns, of relationships that are there that you need to negotiate, right? Let's just be real about it. And so how do we do that? So as you think about, you don't need to solve it all right now, but I just want you to think about, where do you need to move your congregation in the next 3 to 5 years, and what gets in the way of making that change? So feel free to be confessional, to be like, I'm scared, like, I don't want to do it. I'm afraid I'm going to damage relationships, or I know that so-and-so is going to be against it. Whatever gets in the way, please just be frank with one another, because that's the reality of the situation. Okay, any questions about this before we go into this break? We're going to do, Enton and I talked about 15 minutes for it. So y'all are going to be divided. So just make sure 15 minutes, I think we'll go faster than you think. Enton, we're going to have, what do we say, 4 or 5 per group, or 3 or 4? I forget what we said.
It'll be 4 per group unless you want to change your mind, Greg.
That's good. So 4 per group. So that means you have about 4 minutes a person, right? And time will fly. So take 15 minutes. You'll see, if you're familiar with these Zoom sessions, you'll see, I think Enton has it set up for a 60-second sort of warning that you'll get before everybody will come back to the group. Any questions? All right. Good luck.
So I have about 10 minutes till the hour, and so we will end the small groups at 5 minutes after the hour for those of you that want to keep track of time, but also message you. And so I'm ready to put you in the rooms. And so unless I see any hands, I'm going to pull the trigger. Okay, here we go. Good. John is back and others are coming back. So welcome everyone as you come back from your small groups. A few more people to come back in yet. Okay, and I think, Greg, that we are all back now. So
excellent.
We can pick right back up.
Time flew for me. I don't know how it went for you all in your groups. But I would love to hear some of the things that you all named. Again, remember, this will go online somewhere, but we'll trust that you can share things here, knowing that. But I'd be curious where you feel like your congregation needs to be in 3 to 5 years. How are you thinking about that? Go ahead, Laura.
I shared that we've not had the conversation yet, but I think in a couple of years, like many, we don't have children attending, and so the classrooms are sitting empty. And so I think the conversation is going to be, how can we open those up to other groups, invite them to make use of that space, and then possibly in turn develop a relationship where maybe they'll begin to attend worship and become a part of the congregation. But I just think it's open, being open to opening up our space to other groups.
Great. Thanks, Laura. Who else?
Nancy has her hand up. Nancy?
Well, we can't wait 3 to 5 years. We're actually at the point, I think we're going to have to sell our building, but we still want to be a church. So there's a lot of things that have to be decided. We still have a minister, and we do, we're right on the Kansas-Missouri border. So we kind of cross districts and do stuff with congregation that has already sold their church, and then the Olathe church. We do a lot of things together. Our youth are together and stuff. So we're not sure where we're going to go, but we're going somewhere because we're not giving up.
Okay. Thank you. Others?
Yeah, I shared from Wenatchee Brethren Baptist Church. One key element of addressing our change in that of membership. So it is now based on participation rather than membership. American Baptist or with the Church of the Brethren don't want to align with any either one of them, but yet want to actively participate. And so we've made some temporary changes to our constitution and bylaws because you had to do that so that you can participate. And for instance, if we wanted to have a one-time activity, a one-time progressive dinner, we would have people sign up to do a one-time progressive dinner that would happen on a Friday night, and then you would have no more responsibility for a while. So you wouldn't sign up for a 3-year commitment to a commission or a team or a lifetime commitment, life sentence to a commission. You could do it, and you would be able to work with a team that would utilize your gifts. Again, and gifts assessment, gifts identification is key to that. Some want to provide hospitality, so that's great. And all I want to do is provide dessert. We'll let you just provide dessert, and then you're done with your responsibilities for a while. So it's more inclusive, much more inclusive than it has been in the past.
Thank you. I love this. I love the way you're thinking about it strategically. Who else?
One thing I heard in my group that I really appreciated was that for most of 2021 and 2022, there were a lot of comments. This isn't my own. There were a lot of comments in a congregation. Well, when we get back to normal, when we can get back. And there was a comment that finally has tempered, and there's a realization there's not a normal to get back to. And even that there was a lot of this change going on before COVID, and COVID then made it evident or accelerated it. And so the new normal is not going back to something. And hopefully if we can embrace that, I think that's what I was hearing, that hopefully a congregation can embrace that and move into what's next.
Okay. Good. Others? All right. So what I want to do now, and bear with me on the technology just for a moment, is I'm going to do this. I've never done this before. Enton just showed me how to do this. So this will be cool if I'm sure we can do it, because Enton will walk me through it. But want to share the PowerPoint as virtual background, so you'll kind of see me at the same time. We're going through some slides. I want to teach a concept called Lawson's architecture, and you'll see what that looks like in just a moment here.
Go, Greg. We know you can do it.
Thank you. All right. Oh, there we go.
Perfect.
All right.
So I would make yourself a little bit larger. There you go. And yep, then skip up to the slide you need and just move yourself around as you need to. So Good job.
Hey, all right, you're a good teacher, Enton. Okay, so we're gonna talk a little bit tonight about Lawson's architecture. We'll talk, if we have time, we'll talk about the marathon model. It's also interesting. If we don't get to it in one of these 2 nights, the marathon model that is, that's fine. I'd be glad to share with you all after the fact if you're interested in knowing more about it. But Lawson's architecture will certainly teach you a lot. So James Lawson is a civil rights leader. He's a pioneer in thought and the nonviolent resistance movement, a thinker, a strategist. He was actually recruited into the movement by Martin Luther King Jr., among others, in the civil rights era and in the civil rights movement here in the U.S. To the degree that he actually was in India for a while, studying Gandhi in thought. After that, he came back and he was called into service here in the U.S. And so Lawson's also a Methodist minister. So he comes at it from a perspective I think that a lot of us would come at it from as well. A lot of where I learned Lawson's architecture is from, there was a PBS documentary several years back now called A Force More Powerful. A Force More Powerful. It's actually, you can find it on YouTube if you just plug that in and you look at it, and it's A Force More Powerful looks at many nonviolent resistance movements through really the 20th century primarily. And so it's Gandhi's, part of Gandhi's movement. It's got Poland's movement. It's got the civil rights movement, the desegregation of lunch counters in Nashville. And that's really where you can see Lawson's architecture unfolding. Now, they don't call it that. I mean, you can watch this documentary and feel really smart now, I think, as you see it, because you can see very clearly the group that Lawson was leading take these steps that have become part of what we call Lawson's architecture. So in this slide, you can see that he obviously, he was willing to be arrested. He was willing to engage in civil disobedience. And he was willing to do so in a very disciplined sort of way, in a very intentional way that I'll explain. So the desegregation of lunch counters occurred in Nashville from 1958 to 1960. And so what's encouraging for me, even just as I look at this and I look at the dates, is to note that something as big as that, as important as that, something that's a change, positive change strategy, doesn't just happen overnight, right? It's not like, hey, y'all, let's go do a sit-in at the lunch counters and hope that it changes. It was a very intentional and strategic effort that took place over a number of years. And here's a little bit about how it happened. So this is Lawson's architecture. See if I move my face off of the thing here. You can see it a little better. There we go. I'll make myself a little smaller there. So the first step in Lawson's architecture is to identify the problem. So as I'm talking this through just briefly tonight, because I know we're up against the timeline here, as I'm talking about this, I want you to be thinking about 2 things. One is I want you to be thinking about the story of Marisa that I shared with you all and how she operated in Campo Limpo in that neighborhood, right? And then the other thing I want you to be thinking about as well is how you answered that small group question in terms of where your congregation needs to move in the next 3 to 5 years and what's going to be getting in the way of making that change. Okay, so in Lawson's architecture, first you identify the problem. So if you think back to Marisa, the problem was, hey, people aren't getting educated. If we were going to use the desegregation of lunch counters in Nashville, what we're going to be talking about is the desegregation of lunch counters in Nashville. So obviously the big problem was racism, but they realized that was much too big. You can't tackle racism in a society in a bite-sized piece. And so what they realized is that they needed to be very disciplined about identifying the problem. And so the problem that they chose was the desegregation of lunch counters in Nashville. And then they got about strategizing. And so when I say they, I'm talking about a group of Fisk University students, which is a historically Black college in Nashville. This was John Lewis, Representative John Lewis was part of this group when he was a college student, and you can see this in the documentary if you watch it. Diane Nash, who was also a leader in the civil rights movement for many years, was part of this group too. And so they were just students at the time. And so Lawson was brought in to help them with this. And so their strategy, after they identified that problem, they sat down and they actually thought through, what does it look like to make this happen? What are we going to do? What are the assets that we have? What are the challenges that we're going to face? So when I asked you what gets in the way of making the change that you're talking about, I'm asking you to get very real about strategy. I'm asking you to get very real about the obstacles that you're going to face, because what happens so often, whether it's a big social movement or whether it's something that somebody wants to take 3 pews out of the back of a church, right? We often go from identify the problem straight to the action. So you see the action, whoop, see if I can do that. You see the action down there? Often we go straight from identify the problem to the action, and then we're surprised that it doesn't work. And so if any of you, I've been a part of a bunch of protest movements, social change movements. When I was in the Church of the Brethren Washington office, it was a big part of what we did, right? And so we would do that, but so often you'd see a lot of them derail because they never really spent the time strategizing. They just said, hey, we need to stop this. Let's go act. Let's go protest. Let's go march. Let's boycott, whatever. And it would often fall flat because there wasn't much strategy behind it. So the strategy part is really important. After strategy comes recruitment. And that's part of the strategy too. How do we recruit people into this movement? Okay, so who were the people who might also want to see this happening? Now, this is where I want to offer a healthy dose of reality and some caution in the life of a congregation, because we've all seen this happen in a congregation where people start recruiting other people, sometimes in subversive sorts of ways, right? So we see people start to recruit like, oh, hey, I'm gonna keep using this three pews in the back of the sanctuary. That's a great example. I don't know how it actually unfolded there, but they might say, oh, don't you think we should get rid of those 3 pews? And somebody might say, no, I think that's a bad idea. And other people might say, yes, I think that's a good idea. But then you start creating these barriers. When you think about recruitment, I want you to think about recruitment in a congregation as a very transparent sort of effort, right? I want you to be thinking about how you share information in a transparent sort of way and through the proper channels, right? If you've got a commission that needs to go through, start to talk about it with the commission. Start to think about how this can unfold in a natural way, right? And then that might be part of your recruitment strategy too, where you have conversations, where you think about how you can lay this out to people that will make sense, that will be effective. So recruitment is a big part of it. After the recruitment comes the training. So in Nashville, they realized they wanted to desegregate lunch counters. And their idea was, we're going to have their strategy, we're going to have sit-ins, and we're going to recruit college students to be part of these sit-ins, right? So if college students get arrested, they don't have jobs that they need to be at, right? They don't have families that they need to feed. So college students are a great group to recruit for this particular strategy. And so they recruited college students to do this. And then this is where Lawson really came in and flexed all that knowledge that he had about nonviolent change movements. They actually started to train. They had sessions where they would work through their strategy of nonviolent resistance. They talked about what it would look like if somebody tried to beat them, if somebody threw food at them or spat on them, all these kinds of things that you're going to need to have training on, because we're not used to reacting to highly charged situations like that. So in their case, they started to think about, well, how do we train for this? Going back to Marisa, right? Her strategy was, we need to get education. And remember, you may not have known it at the time, but I was sneaking it in there. Her strategy was, I'm going to pick one street in one favela, and then I'm going to start just by getting to know the kids. We're going to start with games. Then we're going to sneak in some education in those games. And then we're going to get a little more formal with some tutoring, right? That's how Marisa went about it. And she thought very carefully about the kids and how she could recruit them in, and then how she could begin to support the families. Okay? So the training is really important, often skipped. Then you get to the action. So it's really fascinating. In what happened in Nashville was they went to do the sit-ins at the lunch counter, and what the Woolworths and the other lunch counters did was they just shut the counters down. They shut the lunch counters down. They stopped serving food to anybody. And so actually the movement, they kind of felt like they failed. They kind of felt like it was a flop. And it didn't get any publicity. It was like on page 10 of the newspaper, like some students went in, they had a sit-in, and then the lunch counters closed, no big deal. Which brings us to the next part, which is the assessment. So during the assessment phase, so what they did was they went back and they said, whoa, well, we sort of succeeded, but we didn't get the kind of splash that we were hoping for, right? We certainly didn't desegregate lunch counters. And so they went back and they started to think about how they could ratchet up the intensity a bit more. And so you see that this goes in a cycle, right? And what you're going to need to do to make something happen, even in a church, is you're going to have to go through this cycle multiple times. You might get to this point, and a lot of times what happens is what the problem that you thought was a problem actually wasn't the problem, right? So I think that could happen in a lot of the cases that you all brought up in your congregations. You know, it might be interesting. You might, for example, like, what do we do with this empty building? You might think one thing is the problem, or is the solution. But in going through this process, you might realize that, oh, there's another opportunity that presents itself. You might realize, oh, well, that's not really the problem. The problem is something else. So there is intentionality to going back to identifying the problem. And then, you know, this isn't glamorous, but you do it all over again. So with the lunch counter desegregation, it is so awesome in this video, because what they did was they went back to desegregate the lunch counters. And this time, what they did was they actually let it be known publicly that they were going to do it. And so they knew that that would start to sort of foment tension in the community. And they knew, or they had hoped, that that would actually bring out some folks who might be opposed to what they are doing. And that's exactly what happened. And so you had essentially a bunch of thugs come who wanted to shut them down and who wanted to keep them away. And so it actually created a lot more tension. And so they did it again. And what happened was the cops actually came in and arrested them. So the third time they did it, they had two more waves of students who would come in after that. So they went through, they re-strategized, and they said, oh, if they arrest us again, what we're going to do is we're going to have two more waves. And so there's this beautiful moment in the documentary where they say, so the cops came and arrested the first wave, and then another group of students came in, and they all just looked at each other like, huh, what's going on here? And so they actually they realized that strategy would put more pressure on the police. And then what happened was they started to have greater impact in the community. So all throughout this, and Lawson is incredible in the way he talks about the discipline that's needed for this kind of change. So I'm going to be totally honest with you. When I work with nonprofit organizations, churches, or businesses, and using this model in their organizations, a lot of times people get stumped and stuck because they don't have the discipline to stick with it. Right? So the discipline with Lawson and that group was, we need to keep going back to the strategy, and we need to stay on point. Right? So they did things like they buddied up, but they never put, the way they say it is a Black person with a white person of opposite gender, and they say very clearly, because that's not the battle we're fighting. Right? So even though that could be part of their ethic, that sure, Black people and white people of opposite sex and gender could communicate, could be with one another. What they were doing in this case was desegregating lunch counters. You see this in churches all the time, right? You start a conversation about one thing, and then whoop, it veers off. And all of a sudden you're talking about something else because you haven't stayed disciplined to what you're really all about. Okay, I can say a lot more about this, and I will tomorrow night, but I know we're down to 4 minutes. So what I want to do is turn my funny talking head off, if I know how to do that, and just give a moment here for any comments that you might have, any questions that you might have about anything that we've talked about tonight, and also Lawson's architecture, because I know I sort of whipped through that. Sometimes I spend an hour or an hour and a half on that alone. It's really rich. So what are your comments just as we wrap tonight up, knowing that we also have tomorrow night to get into this as well?
This is Carolyn Schrock. I just want to correct your 3 pews at the back of the church.
Okay.
They are not at the back of the church. They are scattered throughout.
Okay.
One toward the front, one toward the back, one on the other side.
Okay. Thanks, Carolyn.
This is Alice. I assume that you can end up with a different problem than you first identified. Is that correct?
That is absolutely correct. That is 100% correct.
You just have to strategize differently then for the new problem. Okay.
And yeah, that's one of the beautiful parts of this model. And so you can see how you can't, and this is a problem again that we often have, is we hold on really tightly, right? Like we feel like, oh, I've got the solution to this. If only we just did this. If only they, as pastor, I've been a pastor in a lot of different places. I'm a, shocker here, right? You've known me for 90 minutes, but I'm a pusher, right? I'm always like, hey, let's do this. Hey, let's try this. My personality type on the disc is I'm a high D. Like, if it ain't broke, let's break it and build it back together better, right? And that's a little weird, right? So what I do is I want to hold on to it really tightly, right? Oh, this is the answer. So what Lawson's architecture forces me to do, forces us to do, is say, okay, is that really the problem? And is that really the solution? So you start with a kernel of an idea and you go at it, but you realize that you can't hold that too tightly. Good insight. What else?
Catherine, do you want to get a word in edgewise?
I don't need an answer. I'd just be really intrigued if you could carve out some time, and maybe that's part of your plan tomorrow, to talk about this model in a world that's moving so fast, in churches that are already behind the 8 ball.
Yeah.
It needs to happen tomorrow. And so that, how do you reconcile the time frame that it takes to make change happen with the reality that it needed to happen yesterday? I'd be real at some point in having that conversation.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, let's get to that tomorrow. I love it. Making a note of it here.
Majeska, I see your hand.
Go ahead.
And you're still muted. Sorry. Go ahead and unmute and we'll catch your question.
Okay. Sorry. Are there any brethren congregations who have already very intentionally used this Lawson architecture?
I don't know of any who are doing it now. I know that I have practiced it and used it, although I full disclosure, and this will go out all over the net, right, whoever wants to watch it. But I use this at Elizabethtown Church of the Brethren. We didn't say this is what we were doing, but this is how we as leadership often went about making changes or working at changes in the life of the congregation. Go ahead, Colleen.
Yeah, without calling it that, I can see through the retrospectoscope that this is exactly what the Wenatchee Brethren Baptist Church did when we faced our issue of not being able to support our enormous building. We were not being good stewards of the sacred space. And by identifying the problem, it looks like we did exactly what this was, and we didn't know we were doing it. But it took 3 years and lots of prayer and discernment, but it finally worked in that we transferred ownership to an Anglican church that wanted our building. They've been worshiping with us for almost 12 years, 10, 11 years now. And we did this, but we didn't know we were doing it.
Good.
But it worked. And I see a couple of these things were happening at the same time because of the process, because of where we were with our building folks and our planning folks and our architects and all that. But I see that that's what we did.
Excellent.
It's a great.
So let's do, we're out of time, and I do want to respect your time. Let's get one more comment in before we wrap up for the night. Anybody have one? Alexi, yeah.
Yeah, so I don't want to jump the gun on whatever you have prepared for us tomorrow, because I'm sure it's good. But I think the part that I would love to hear more about is that at least in my context, I've seen us move through these steps and the different things that we have going on, and we have so much going on. But I think the pastoral question that I have maybe is, what strategies do you have to cultivate that discipline? Because I think in both cases, when there's been something we want to call success, but also something maybe not as successful, once we get to an outcome, I think there's just less energy behind that momentum to keep pushing. And so just would love to hear more about strategies for what that, cultivating that discipline looks like.
Love it. Thank you. Yeah, let's talk about it tomorrow.
That's good.
Okay, so thank you all. Time flies. I really appreciate that. I appreciate your engagement in this. Tomorrow we will get at some of these questions, be thinking about other questions you would bring to it. You know, we'll have an opportunity to learn from one another. I know there's a lot of wisdom in this group, so I hope you'll share it with one another. The other thing that you can do is I'll just remind you that if you wanted to go take a look, it's 22 minutes long, so not a ton of time, but A Force More Powerful is the name of the documentary that you can find. You can find it, like I said, on YouTube. You just plug that in, search for that, and you'll find it. Now it's got the way it's on there is like, I think, an hour and a half or more, and this is only 22-minute segment. So you gotta kind of do a little fast forwarding around, look for it a little bit. But you'll find it because you'll see, you know, it's Nashville and it looks like 1960. It's not Gandhi and it's not Poland, so not South Africa. You'll see it, you'll find it. So that's, if you want to do a little homework, that might be cool to take a look at before tomorrow.
And I'll find the link and send it out to you tomorrow morning.
Great idea. Thanks, Ensign.
As well as Greg, you said you had a handout we might want to share.
Yeah, so what I'm going to do, I've already emailed that to you, Enton, is just the 6-part cycle. I have just a simple handout that's in a Word document that I sent to Enton, and he said he can forward that on to you too, so that if it's helpful to print that and have that in front of you as you start to take a look, and you can do that as well.
Great. So Greg, thanks. Same time, same place tomorrow. For those of you that may not be able to make it, feel free to watch your emails, because I'll be sending a link to the recording for you as soon as we get that posted, and that'll be the recording of both sessions so that you'll be able to catch up with whatever you've missed. Greg, thank you so much, and we look forward to all of you coming back tomorrow.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
So friends, welcome back. Thank you for being the ones that have returned and have the time to be able to do that. We know that some of you will need to leave early, come and go as you need to, but know that I'm recording once again, and we'll make that recording available for you. Since Greg, I introduced you last night, I don't feel the need to say a whole lot more. Those of us here are already getting to know you, and getting to know you is better than anything I could share about past or history. And so I just want to turn it over to you and let you pick up where we left off.
All right. right, terrific. Well, thank you, Ensign. I really appreciate it, and appreciate all the hosting you're doing. And so, folks, I'm curious, as you've had 24 hours, a little less than, and actually, but as you think about some of the concepts that were introduced, are there ideas that are sticking with you? Are there images that are sticking with you? I do want to formally review Lawson's architecture in just a minute here, but I'm just really curious. How are you ruminating on this? Where are you seeing connection? So just unmute yourself and share with the whole group.
This is Lois Grove, and I'm seeing connections because this is being talked about every church meeting I go to these days.
I'm sorry, I think the internet cut out. What's being talked about?
What you're talking about, church and change. It's the topic du jour.
Yeah, yeah. And what spirit is it brought up in, Lois?
Well, last Sunday I was listening to sermon, and they talked about us being they talked about the exile in Jeremiah, and I thought, well, I think I get it. I think we're in the exile now, and we're looking back at the past and trying to find, we want to go back like it was in the olden days, and we don't like this, and we're being exiled to so many things to that are captivating us that we don't like, and so I guess. So how do we get out of the exile and move forward? Take the best of the past and go forward with whatever God is calling us to in the future.
Yeah, that's really well said. Yeah, and I think even as we look at our biblical narrative, both Hebrew Bible and New Testament, it is a story of change. It is just one change after another, and tough times followed by better times, followed by tough times, followed by better times. And so that actually, while that might sound discouraging, I actually take a lot of encouragement from it, knowing that and feeling like my attitude as a statement of faith is, all right, so the church may have a hard time figuring it out, but somehow God always seems to shine through, right? And I have confidence that'll be the case going forward. Great comment. Thank you, Lois. What else? What are some other things y'all have been ruminating on? Go ahead, Monica.
I was thinking about this framework that you've offered as a possibility through Lawson's architecture. And I think what I love about that is that the circle continues. So there's assessment and then it kind of starts. And I do think that even when as a church or as a community, we go through a really good and important process and thoughtful process, we often don't ever go back into the process. We say, oh, look, we did the thing that addressed the change and it's going to be great. And then 3 years later, but we did that thing. Why are we not seeing the results we want? Because we so rarely, for whatever reason, energy or interest, we so rarely go back and reassess and make future changes.
Do you think, Monica, that's because the original, sort of the identification of the problem in Lawson's terms, do you think that's because it wasn't narrowly defined enough or well defined enough? Or do you think it's fatigue that just gets the better of us in organizations?
Yeah, I don't know that it's the definition, but I do know that even as we're addressing one part of what's going on, there's usually in what we're trying to do with the church, attract more young families, get more people interested in serving the church. I mean, those are so much larger than some single way to address it. And so we may come up with some really great ideas and even experiment and test them out. But I do think there's something about energy level. There's something about humanity that just wants to find the quick fix and do it and then feel great about what we've done. So.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Alice, I see your hand, but I'm going to jump in first. To tie in with Monica, I think it's the Nashville lunch counter as well. Things change as we implement. And if we don't reassess, we don't readjust and find the new possibilities. So, okay, Alice, over to you.
I was gonna say, I think we're too tied to our building. You know, we think we have to be in that building, and like Bill said, you had more people at your meal, your weekly meal, than you had at church on Sunday morning. I think we need to be doing more of that kind of thing that's outside the building or a different time than church, formal church. People aren't liking formal church anymore. I do, but a lot of people don't. So connecting where people are somehow.
And so maybe the problem, if I can put words in your mouth and correct me if I'm wrong, the problem may not be what we think it is. We think the problem is, hey, people aren't in the church building. That's the problem. When that may not actually be the problem. Maybe the problem is, or the question is, how do we connect with people? How do we create those relationships? How do we bring God to where people are? You know, it could be any of those kinds of questions.
Well, with school having everything on Sundays anymore, it's hard for families to let their kids be in sports and yet make it to Sunday services. It doesn't coincide. I mean, they're overlapping, or they're at different, they're at too close of times or something. You know, I think we need to think of it differently. It doesn't have to be Sunday morning, and it doesn't have to be at 10 o'clock or whatever.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So for those of you who are just jumping on, the kind of a starter question I asked was, what have you been ruminating on over the last 24 hours as you've learned Lawson's architecture, been reacquainted with it? Have you thought about Marisa's story and Danilo's story? And this, you know, that's a great success story. And of course that had to keep going in certain ways. What's on your mind as you come into tonight?
I was thinking about this Lawson's architecture also, and thinking about going through the process of making a change using a similar system, and but it ended up sometimes as a project, and once we find a little bit of success in it, people relax and go back to the old ways.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm curious, did anybody have an opportunity to watch the video? Enton looked that up and cut and pasted it in. So Catherine, you saw it. What did you notice there? Because I only covered about, it's a 22-minute video. I probably covered about 10 minutes of it, maybe if that.
Well, I was doing some other things that I could let it run. So I watched a good portion of it. And I think it was a good reminder. And it led me down a bit of a rabbit hole for about 30 minutes because I was highly aware of all of their examples are pre-COVID. And so I thought about applying all of that in a post-COVID environment. And I just kept coming back to my question that was present last night. How do you apply that kind of process system? How do you speed it up? And so I did a little deep dive just to see what corporate is having to say about that in this day and age. And there's a lot of thought out there in the last 6 months about how you push that timeline. And corporate has the luxury of a CEO who's in charge, and a church has the luxury of 200 people having an opinion. And so I'm still really curious about how you push change when you've got all volunteers and you need to get it done quickly. And so I just kept thinking about the loop and thinking about the system and thinking about, wow, how do you do that faster?
Yeah. So, oh my gosh, I want to dig into this. I also don't want to sidetrack us too much. Can we come back to that? Are you one of the folks that needs to jump off early?
No. And we don't even have to, that's my own particular need, and I can do the rabbit hole myself, or we can talk privately. I mean, I don't want to
Yeah,
either.
but
Let's
it is so relevant to what we're talking about here, especially when you start talking about, and I think I said this last night. I work with businesses too, and after having worked in the church, doing change initiatives in businesses is easy. Not, and that's saying none of it's easy, right? But it's easy compared to doing that kind of work in a congregation for some of the dynamics that you just named. So I think it's so relevant, and I do want to spend some time on that tonight, and I want us to share some of that wisdom with one another. Majeska, you asked the question, where's the link to the video? Enton sent an email. I think it was last night you sent the email, Enton. And so it had the link to relinked it to tonight's Zoom call, as well as having the link to the video in there. So I think, Catherine, just to make a very direct connection to the speed at what, I did take 2 years to desegregate lunch counters, but in a way, if you think about it, so what happened, and the reason I asked about the end of the video is, so what happened in Nashville was they desegregated the lunch counters, which took some time, right? But most of the action there, a lot of it was prep time. And then most of the real action happened over Easter time, actually, in 1960. And so things accelerated very quickly. A lot of change happened very quickly. And then the lunch counters were desegregated. But what it also did, and partially because of the value of the nonviolent movement that they were part of, they didn't go about shaming the folks who were practicing this segregation. What they did was they actually, because that was one of the hurdles that the lunch counters were running into, they didn't know how to go about saying, okay, now we're integrated. And so what they did was they had sort of closed door conversations where they said, okay, this is what you're going to do, this is how you're going to do it. And so they opened that up, and they all agreed that was going to be no news. That's just going to be, we're going to return to a new normal. So that, to break out a COVID term, we're going to start a new normal now. And then what that did was it started a domino effect where not just lunch counters, but then restaurants and movie theaters and other places that were not directly impacted by these sit-ins then started to desegregate as well. And so it really, it takes a long time, but when you get everything set up correctly, then you can have a pretty big impact in a short amount of time. So that's just encouragement from that model that you'll also see in church models, because what you're doing in this model is you're not only working towards one specific problem, but you're also training a community how to get used to it. You're training a community how we talk openly about these things, because these are not subversive sorts of things like sometimes we do in church. They are things that are out in the open. We're working at this. How are we going to do it? This is how we're going to do it. We're going to bring this group in. And if you maintain a high level of transparency in this in a congregation, yes, you will hear grumbling, but as success starts to roll around, you'll hear less grumbling. So thank you. All right, other folks, I went on a tangent there, my apologies, but other folks, what hit you? What have you been thinking about since we met last evening? Okay. Okay, so here's what I want to do. I want to see if I can share screen again. I think you need to, Benton, do you need to give me co-host? I'm going to try that fancy my talking head in the.
Thanks, Greg. You're all set now.
All right. So background. All right, so let me fast forward. We'll trip down memory lane here.
Yeah, nicely done, Greg. And if you can enlarge yourself a little, that'll be great.
There we Okay, so just for the sake of refreshing, and again, what I want you to be thinking about as I'm talking about this, just real briefly, is I want you to be thinking about Marisa and what she did there in Campo Limpo. I want you to be thinking about the things you talked about in your small group when you thought, when the question was asked, in the next 3 to 5 years, where do you need to move your congregation, right? So I want you to be thinking about that. You can think about past successes and how they integrated into this, all right? And you think obviously about that example of the Nashville lunch counters. So first thing, and we've talked a little bit about it already, is this identification of the problem. How do we identify a problem? And we talked about it. It's not a big problem. This is a bite-sized problem, right? This is a bite-sized problem that will hopefully lead to domino effect, but it's a bite-sized problem that you want to identify as specifically as possible. So to use that Lawson term of discipline, you got to have the discipline to say, this is what we're really about. This is the problem that we are addressing in this moment. So you identify the problem, you go into strategy. So in strategy, you're thinking through, how are we actually going to get this done? Who are the people we need to mobilize? What is the resistance that we're likely to encounter? Again, I know this gets a little uncomfortable in congregational settings, but I think it can be done in a respectful sort of way. So if you're talking about changing worship or something, you can say, well, okay, I think we can expect some resistance from folks who like things the way they are. I think we can expect some resistance from, maybe it's a musician who is accustomed to doing things a certain way, et cetera, et cetera. So done in respect, you got to be real about it. After you go from strategy, you start to think about recruitment. In church settings, if you're working in a very formal church structure, you're thinking about, and I'll use this example of a change to worship. Okay, is there a worship commission or committee that you need to be talking to? Is there that musician that you need to be talking to? Are there other leaders who you want to be bouncing the idea off of and hopefully getting and building some momentum around this potential shift that you're talking about? From there, you want to be training. So in this sense, that could be educating, right? Educating people to what the change might look like in the congregation. What is this actually going to be? Because if you're going about change, we've all seen this in congregations, right? We've all seen this dynamic where a change just sort of seems to drop out of nowhere and it lands. And usually it lands with a thud, a big old thud, because people say, wait a minute, where did that come from? And people feel left out of the loop, and then they don't appreciate that. And so part of the training is educating in a congregational setting and communicating with folks. This is what's going on. This is why it's happening, right? So training, then you do the action, then you make the change. And then after you do, you go into assessment mode. And then of course we go through cycle once again. Is the problem really what we thought it was? Is this really what we want to be about? Is the strategy somewhat different? We go back to Nashville and we think about how they realized it was it fizzled at first, right? It was page 10 news. They wanted to be page 1 news. They wanted to be above the fold, right? So they thought about how they could increase the intensity to make it happen. And in that case, I'll share a little bit more of the story now. The intensity increased to the extent that downtown got really uncomfortable. And they realized that downtown was getting really uncomfortable. And what that actually did was put a lot of pressure on the other businesses downtown, because people didn't want to be around where there might be some fighting that would break out. And so you had other businesses start to get really resistant to that. And then they added the churches in the area. And so the churches, mostly African-American churches, started to get behind this because they weren't sure about this. They didn't know if they wanted to be part of what was seen as a pretty radical thing that these students were doing. But what they could do, and they realized they could do, is they could do a boycott. And so these churches began to take part in the boycott. They got the pastors in the area on board. And so everybody could participate. This session really isn't about social change movements, but that's a really big part of a social change. The best social change movements create opportunities for every single person, regardless of their ability or where they're placed, to participate in the movement. So if these were students at first, they had the sort of quote unquote luxury of being able to get arrested without a big impact to their life, or less than, you know, somebody who maybe had a job and a family. Now there's opportunities for other folks to get involved. So you might think about that. How does that work when you're thinking through strategically about how this is going to go in the life of your congregation if it's a bigger change? After the boycott in Nashville, things started to really intensify. The mayor got involved. Things got so tense that one of the lead lawyers, Holmes, an African-American lawyer in Nashville who was defending the students and was organizing legal support for the students, his home was bombed. And after that, people really said, whoa, what is going on here? And thankfully, nobody was hurt in that bombing, but it did kind of let everybody know that it kind of shook people to reality in some sense that, wait a minute, if people are radical enough to do that over this topic, well, maybe I need to rethink this topic if I was on the fence before, and I really need to align myself with the right side in this case. So they did that, and then they eventually got to the place where they sort of very publicly asked the mayor what he thought. And interestingly, in that story, the way it goes, I mentioned Diane Nash yesterday. So she was a student at the time. So it's great in the video. This happens at the very end. They have this march that goes through the town and up to City Hall, and the mayor meets them on the steps of City Hall. And you think, oh boy, this is gonna be a showdown, right? Mayor's meeting them on the steps as they come in. And the moment they show is there is a pastor, you know, apologies to all of us pastors out there, right? But there's a pastor arguing with the mayor, like trying to convince the mayor, getting into an argument. And Diane Nash walks up and says, Mr. Mayor, do you think it's right that these lunch counters take our other business, but won't serve us at the lunch counter? And he says, no, I don't think that's right. So it was very, you know, it was astonishing that you got all that hubbub. She cuts right to it, gives him the opportunity to essentially do the right thing, and he chooses to walk through the door. And that's sort of the highlight of that story. So as you're thinking about it, they were constantly going through re-strategizing, figuring out how they're going to include more people in the process than the natural steps of recruitment, training, and so on and so forth. So I just wanted to give this little recap to refresh our memories of where we went yesterday. All right. Any questions? I'm going to come off of share. I hope that you all got also, Ensign also sent a Word version of this that's probably even a little prettier, and it has a link to the video, or at least tells where the video comes from, that you can refer to. I wanted you to have that so that you could refer to that. Let me get off screen share here. If I can. Questions, comments? What do you all think?
Greg, the stop screen share should be at the top of your window.
Oh, there it is. Yeah, I always want to look for it back in the screen share section. Thanks, Enton. Thoughts now? Go ahead, Alice. You're back muted again, Alice.
Now it says mute. Okay. I was thinking of an example where Mary Jane Button Harrison, who is Disciples and Church of the Brethren pastor, they thought their space was too big and they wanted to do a food pantry. There was a lot of opposition, and so they went through this process very slowly. They got all the objections out and worked through how that could be fixed. And then they did a deliberate discussion about how they could make it work. And it took a long time, but they eventually turned their basement into a food pantry and meal preparation place for homeless people. And so they went through this type of process, it seems like to me.
Yeah,
And
excellent.
that's very active, and it included parking and things like that that make the church accessible to people that are handicapped.
Thank you. So I'm curious, that small group question that was posed last night, where do you need to move your congregation in the next 3 to 5 years? If you feel comfortable, what'd you say? Y'all just didn't take breaks the whole time, did you?
Well, I'll share.
Go ahead, John.
I'm John Edwards, and I just started an interim pastorate a month and a half ago at the Sydney, Southern Ohio District Church of the Brethren. And the goal was, for a year's time, I'm to help them to decide what to do. They're thinking of selling their church or divesting themselves of the property. It's a beautiful facility. They have a daycare that meets there and has for the last 25 years, and they support them money-wise. Plus, the congregation doesn't hurt for money, although it's a very small congregation. But they don't know where to go or what to do because they just feel like the facility has outgrown the congregation.
Mm-hmm.
And they thought they might move to a smaller place. They don't know what to do. Well, one of the women in the church, her neighbor, is a pastor of a larger 100 to 140. It was an Assemblies of God, but the Assemblies of God has stepped in and told them that they're disfellowshipping the whole church and himself because they aren't charismatic enough. He said, no, we're not charismatic. Plus, they didn't think they were, I don't understand this, but they didn't think they were, they were not open enough in their membership. But he said he's half Hispanic. He's got other Hispanics in his church. He has no other races than that. But he said the whole congregation's behind him. And she said, well, she was telling him about her problems. So they put their heads together and thought it'd be interesting for him to come and visit the church with his whole congregation, he said, some Sunday. And think perhaps, and of course she said they would never leave the Church of the Brethren, but of course they've already been disfellowshipped from the Assemblies of God. So maybe this is God working in a certain way that way. So this Lawson's architecture gave me some kind of a structure, at least, to approach the whole thing.
Interesting. Great. Thank you for sharing. Love it.
This is Lois Gross. I was not here last night. Was somebody else's hand up? I'm sorry. I don't want to interrupt.
Go ahead, Lois.
But I had time yesterday. We just got our messenger yesterday, and I read it. And I was reading about the Bridgewater Church, the article in there. And if all of you haven't gotten your messengers yet, if you have, well, look at that article about how they changed their model of calling pastors. And it seems to me like, as I remember the article, and I wasn't here last night, but Bill went over all the notes with me, that perhaps they used much of this Lawson model in what they were doing there at Bridgewater to come to a different way of doing pastor.
Interesting.
Did anybody else read it? No.
I haven't got mine yet.
Okay. Okay.
So here's a little provocative thought. What I've seen as I work with congregations and as I've been part of the Church of the Brethren for my whole life, and pretty much most of my professional life, is that if it seems to me, I'm really interested in this article now, it seems to me that the Church of the Brethren has somewhat of a leadership crisis. And we could talk about lots of reasons for that. A lot of denominations are having leadership crises. But I think the provocative part is I can't help but wonder if one of the reasons that leadership is a spiritual gift, right? Leadership is named in Romans as something that people have been gifted with. I feel like often in the Church of the Brethren, though, we look a little sideways at leaders. We have a little bit of a mistrust of leaders. And oftentimes I hear that sort of slathered with priesthood of all believers language, right? We don't believe anyone is greater than anybody else in the eyes of God, of course, right? And we do believe that we all have equal footing in the church. However, we also call pastors and we call people to be board chairs and moderators and leaders of commissions and committees and all these other things. But we get really uncomfortable when it comes to that leader saying, hey, y'all, why don't we think about going over here? I see Annalisa shaking her head. What are you thinking?
I'm thinking that one thing I've been taught non-verbally in the Church of the Brethren is that people who ask for leadership or people who name themselves as having gifts for leadership are suspicious.
Mm-hmm.
And another piece of that then as a pastor would be, and I think I can only talk about this as a woman who's a pastor, but I feel like I have to work really hard to, I know this is being recorded. Oh, I hope I won't regret it later, but I feel like I have to work really hard to help convince people that something was their idea, even though it might have been mine, but we will only embrace something that feels like it was an idea of the people, even though we were desperate for something to happen. But we don't just want some like dynamic pastor to lead us down some road. So it's really cumbersome to be a leader in a culture that values non-hierarchy. And I love the non-hierarchy. I think it's right, but it's so hard.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's really well said. Other folks' thoughts on this topic. And the reason I'm asking or mentioning it is because Lawson's architecture is sort of predicated on this notion that somebody is going to stand up and say, hey, there's a problem, right? And this is what we think it is, or this is what I think it is, or what do you all think about this? Because I think it's a problem. And then starts to generate conversation and action from there. But it requires this notion of, hey, somebody's going to raise their hand or stick their head up. And Annalisa, thank you, Annalisa, that's great. or convince everybody that it's their idea, right? What do y'all think? Go ahead, Laura.
I think sometimes we struggle with identifying a problem. I think because then that initiates a change. And so I think we struggle sometimes with identifying a problem. And like Annalisa said, we don't want to be the ones to put the hand up or say, hey, there's an issue. I may see it, and I hope that, and so then I would hope that somebody else would see it and speak up. Because sometimes as a pastor, I struggle with doing that because I don't want to be seen as the pastor who's pointing out these problems and wanting to make these changes.
Why is that?
Well, I think because I think because the folks have a hard time changing, and none of us, if I'm wrong, tell me, but we struggle as humans with making change. We don't like change because then that means we have to do something different.
Yeah.
So I think once you begin to identify, say there's a problem, then we have to do some changes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think we struggle with that, or at least I do sometimes, because I can see it, and I just hope the others see it, so then we can begin to work through it.
Thank you for your candor. Really appreciate that. Enton.
I'll simply add, tagging into Laura, that people like to shoot the messenger.
Mm-hmm.
And if we're the ones that are always identifying the problems, which would make sense because we're the ones as pastoral leadership paying attention to what's going on. But if we're always identifying the problems, we become the identified patient.
Mhm.
Carolyn, go ahead.
I'd like to offer a suggestion of how to get people to think that it is their idea.
Okay.
My husband tells this story, so this is all from him. But he learned this from the chief that we lived beside in South Sudan. And the chief taught Raj that the best way to get people to accept change is through asking the right questions, so that they, in answering your questions, are giving the idea, and therefore the new plan is theirs. The chief said the leader does not tell them what to do, but pulls it out of them through questioning.
Interesting. Sort of a Socratic method almost. That's great. This is good. This is good conversation.
Carolyn, I think that is so good. So thank you, and Roger, for that. And Laura can speak to this too. When we were in the same church and I was chair of the board, I thought I could see where the church was headed with so many people dying and the finances going down, and I could kind of project that what was going to be the church's situation 10 years out. So without much wisdom, I said that to the board one night. And it was the wrong thing to do because I traumatized the people. And so the messenger, how the messenger does it, Carolyn, asking the questions would have been far better approach than for me to state the problem as I saw it that night, because I actually did more harm than good.
Yeah, and there's a both and nature to this, I think, too. Not forgetting some of what Annalisa was saying, just in the sense that we have this in the Church of the Brethren, especially, we have this skepticism, right? If you're too out front, if you name something too directly, then it's suspicious or has an agenda. It's really fascinating. I wonder if we could get to a point where we as leaders could do it skillfully, of course, Lois, but also that we could, and I'm going to say this in a way that might sound derogatory, but that we could be a little more grown up about it and say, yeah, we have a problem. Yeah, what are we going to do about that? How are we going to work at this together? That's one of those edges that business has compared to congregational life sometimes, which is sort of ironic, because I would love for us to be communities where we can trust one another enough to share hard things with one another.
I debriefed this with our son who works with trauma, and he said that people losing a church or seeing their church go away is trauma, and that we need to face that. And so I was not the grown up, as you say, and I will own that.
Very big of you. Other thoughts on this? I'm glad we're taking this bunny trail. I think it's really important. I think it's important to our congregations. I know it's important to our denomination. There's another dynamic that I'll just name in the Church of the Brethren, which is because we've had a lot of conflict in recent decades, we tend to, at our worst, I think we elevate this idea of unity to an almost idol-like status. So we want everything to be harmony all the time, because there's so much conflict in other places. And so even if it's an idea that could be a generative idea, but we know it's going to ruffle feathers, we say, oh, I don't know about that. That's going to stir up somebody. Somebody's not going to be happy about that. It's going to ruffle feathers. And so it's kind of a fascinating thing. I'll share a quick story to this effect. In 2008, I think it was, I'm pretty sure it was 8 or 09. I was asked to write a short piece in Messenger, kind of the editorial that they invite people to do each month. And so the piece I wrote essentially said it was coming off of the 300-year anniversary of the Church of the Brethren. And I don't know how many of you were at that annual conference in 2008 in Richmond, but I was struck that you had all these, you had these different segments that had split off in the 1880s, and there were these long, eloquent, and beautiful apologies that we were making to one another for the ways in which we had treated one another all those years ago. And I started to think, we have a lot of contention in the Church of the Brethren right now. This was back in 2008. We have a lot of contention in the church right now. What if we could avoid getting to that level of ugliness that they experienced in the 1880s? So what if right now we could start working at even just a sort of a common understanding that maybe we're not the best for one another right now. Maybe we need to part ways. The way I often jokingly say it is, you would have thought that I spit on Alexander Mack's grave, because the reaction I got from that was vehement. It was, how dare you imply that we should do something like that? And I learned something really important about the value, or how we were placing unity in a way. It wasn't real. I'm no kind of fortune teller. We could have predicted that what's happened now in the Church of the Brethren all these years later would happen, with large swaths of congregations peeling off and doing their own thing. But it shows something very interesting about how we view this notion of unity. And sometimes, unity is a beautiful notion, but sometimes I think we can create more drama, we can create more friction by not sort of naming it and moving through that conflict a little more healthily. Anyway, sorry, I'm bunny trailing like crazy tonight. Okay, so those were two diversions from the question I started with, which was, what in your congregation have you identified? Where do you need to move your congregation as leaders in the church, right? So that's how we got down these money trails, is we need to take responsibility for leadership in our congregations. And that's where the priesthood of all believers stuff comes in really importantly. It's both pastors and lay leaders, right? And there's a mix on this call. How do we as leaders in our congregations start to take these steps? What's going on in your congregation? And what's getting in the way? That was part two. What's getting in the way?
I think what I said the other night was, last night, was that our congregation doesn't know each other. We have the Sunday morning worship group, and we have the midweek Wednesday night meal children and youth group. And we need to somehow get to know each other. So we need some creativity in finding the ways to do that. Because just saying, well, the youth ought to come to church on Sunday morning at 10:15.
That's not working.
That's not working.
Monica, you had unmuted.
Yeah, I think something I think about holding us back, even when we're feeling a call or direction to go, is fear of losing what we know, fear of losing community that we know, or having that community, become some members of that community or the whole community become upset with us. And so, thinking about that in terms of Church of the Brethren, like that's, one of the hardest things to deal with, right? A community is part of our walk with God. And so, yeah, how do we do that while knowing that change means change in those relationships too?
Yeah, one of my favorite quotes recently is, courage is not the absence of fear, but the judgment that there's something more important. Right? So we're afraid of kind of mixing that pot because we're going to lose what we know. I wonder what it takes to get us to the point where we make the judgment, we make the assessment that maybe there's something more important at stake here than just losing what we're familiar and comfortable with. Lexi, go ahead.
Yeah, so I've had a lot of thoughts just ruminating as everyone's shared. So the context that I'm speaking from, I think even goes back to speaking to those 2 points in the greater church that you brought up, Greg. But so the call that I had before this is my church is in transition in many ways. One big one currently is that we are looking for a new treasurer. And the problem that we are running into is that our church is structured in a way that the treasurer, who has been in the place that has served in that role for over 25 years, has done all of these things that no one person in our congregation is gifted to do. It's just not it. And what we are realizing is that in order to fulfill the responsibilities that we need, we have to call other people who have different skills, but together can be patchworked into this thing that we're hoping will succeed, will happen, but we still don't know because it's happening. But I think, and so that ties into your first kind of thing in the greater church, right? This priesthood of all believers is that oftentimes I think that we use that language as a way to welcome people, but we stop there and we don't necessarily use that language when we're calling people who don't have the gifts that we think that they need to do the thing that we want them to do, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So because I need a treasurer, you need to have X, Y, and Z. But if you don't have X, Y, and Z, then you can't be my treasurer. But I'm learning, right? And I context that I need you to help be part of my treasurer team because you have X. And we're going to find the next person. And it's similar to the story you shared last night. But I think that's part of it. And the other extension to that too, that is making me think is in the way that oftentimes it's this idea of unity, right? I think agree, can be used as almost an idol. And it's unity in a certain way. Like we are supposed to be united in this particular structure, in this particular relationship. And it can't be unity as defined in some other way, right? Like we can't be united under this thing unless we agree to those things. And that's the part that we're also having to realize in my current context, right, with my treasurer, is that we need to be united to complete the task of treasurer, but we're gonna have to fulfill it in different relationships rather than just this one thing. And then even going to what Monica, you shared, is that we're taking a huge responsibility and having to entrust 3 separate people in a completely new structure that's never been done before. And that is a really challenging thing, especially right when we're talking about treasurer responsibilities. That's, so all of that is just sharing and have no answers to any questions if any questions were posed. But I think that's where I'm coming from in just a current situation.
No, thank you. I especially appreciate your input on how you're seeing the priesthood of all believers being sort of flexed in a way in that community. Go ahead, Lois, and then we'll go to
Lexi, I just want to say, Lexi, you've kind of told the Ridgewater story right there on a different in your own context. So everybody read the article.
And then we'll wait for your article, Lexi. Go ahead, Anton.
So as I think about obstacles that many of us face in many different contexts, one obstacle I seem to run into, I'll just call nostalgia. It's that there's a problem. The only way to fix it is to look at what we did 30 years ago when there were lots of people or whatever it may be, without realizing that that's not feasible to recover that time, and instead looking for a completely different kind of answer.
Good word. So I saw something a while, Alice, you'll be next. I saw, I forget where it was, an article somewhere written by a church, some church consultant basically. And he said that he identified 3 things that were holding congregations back right now. We're talking about smallish congregations similar to the ones I think we're all part of. And he said, nostalgia, meaning we long for it to be like the good old days, like you said, Anton. Hubris, like arrogance, like there's one way to do church, right? And denial, that everything's okay, we're just gonna get through this. This is just a little hiccup, and then everything's gonna people are gonna come back to their senses again, which is fascinating. But anyway, I want to share that. Those struck me as pretty insightful. Alice, go ahead.
I'm just struck by how the kids at camp are just so wonderful. They enjoy camp. We have probably half of the kids are not even brothers. And they come in with, I don't think this is going to work. I might have to go home. And one of the boys ended up being one of the leaders of the camp. And he was so popular there. He had a terrible time at school. So he was very scared about judgment. And the camp is set up so everybody is a child of God and you are accepted like you are. And I think if we could practice that more in church and be more informal about it like camp is, and the sharing that we do with each other at camp, I think that would be wonderful. Kind of like be children again or something.
Thank you. So let's sort of think about turning the page here. There's another set of small group questions that I wanted to put in front of you. I guess we have, what do we have? 1, 2, 3. We got about 2, do you think 2 groups, Enton? Or what do you think at this point?
I've made 3 to have 4
Okay.
each. So I can combine it to 2 if you'd rather, but 3, I think.
No, that's okay. And then do you still have that language that I gave you, Enton? I could throw up the slide, but it might be easier just to do it.
I'll post it in the chat now.
Okay. So the question that Enton's going to put in there is to say this, thinking back to where you need to move your congregation in the coming years, how could you actually use Lawson's architecture? And again, part of the strategy is thinking about the challenges that will get in the way, right? Wise as serpents, innocent as doves, okay? So this is, let's be people who are using this big noggins that God has gifted us with. And so as you think about in your congregation, where you need to move it and how you might use Lawson's architecture, I want you to think about the challenges that are going to get in the way. So I'm really encouraging you to get very specific, okay? And we'll be sensitive when you come back to the large group, recognizing that this is recorded and will be posted. You don't have to share when you come back, but to remember what Enton said yesterday, in small groups, it's not recorded. So you can say what you need to say. I would encourage you to get very specific. And sort of what I'm hinting around is that there might be a person who you say, I know this person is not going to like this. And so I need to start thinking about how I'm going to approach that. I need to start thinking about who else we need to recruit into this. I need to start thinking about if this is a person who is particularly cantankerous, well, is this an opportunity to talk about that behavior with them? Okay. Or it could be something just more structural. But I want you to get really granular. I want you to think about this in detail. We're going to take, okay, so we've got 33 minutes left. Let's take the full 15 for small groups. So we did last night, right, Anton? Okay, so we'll take the full 15, feel free to do a bio break or whatever you need to do in there to take care of yourselves too. And we'll come back and then we'll start to land this plane, okay? Time flies. It's a shame, but we'll get to it. And Catherine, when we come back, I am curious, to talk about your question of how we might accelerate these sorts of processes. Okay? Have fun.
Okay, I'll call you back at about 12 minutes after the hour if you're looking ahead, but I'll keep you in the loop. Everyone ready? Okay, here we go to your breakout rooms. Okay, Greg, I think we're back, so turning it back to you.
Hey, welcome back, everybody. So curious what kind of ground you covered there. As you thought about the question, what I'll reread it. Thinking back to where you need to move your congregation in the coming years, how will you use Lawson's architecture, and what are the challenges that will get in the way?
I would
Go ahead,
really,
Catherine.
well, I just would really like to identify the problem language and change it to identify the opportunity language. Okay. And I know that sometimes reframing that, okay, what is this opportunity that we're standing in front of? And we were talking in our group, I think it's so appropriate during the Lenten season when Jesus is telling his stories over and over about how do we stand on our heads and look at the world in a different way. And so what is the opportunity and how do we stand upside down and how do we see it as an opportunity? And then I think the rest of the cycle makes so much sense because once there's agreement on, okay, here's the opportunity. Does it match our strategic plan? Does it match who we are? Does it match our mission and vision? And then the rest is mechanics. So I think that helps people. I mean, there's all kinds of models that do the same kind of thing, but I think you have to find the model that connects, that people can most connect to. And so I figure, Lawson's model is one more model to put in front of people to say, this is a stepped process, it's cyclical in nature, and this is all about opportunity, which is what Jesus was all about. Stand on your head and see what the opportunity is.
Great, thank you. Other thoughts from folks? Either you can say vaguely or not so vaguely what you want to say, or you can take the first or second part of the question. Go ahead, Sharon.
Guess I better unmute first. I see in whatever project or change that we want to make in our congregation with families with several children that are active and they're active in their businesses, and it's just time and the busyness and people sorting through what's more important, dealing with the busyness of the family and or the church, and how to balance that.
Thank you. Others? Go ahead, Alice.
I think we talked about a lot of church buildings that would be wearing us down. And
so what are the challenges in that?
Well, for Ivester in Iowa, being rural in the middle of a cornfield between 3 different school districts, how do you utilize your building in a different way? It's probably not the best place for childcare or for after school program, but maybe in some other way we could help with using it other than Sundays. But yeah, we have to be creative, definitely.
You feel like you'd face resistance to ideas about that?
We have talked about it before.
Okay.
And, there were several ideas, meal regularly and inviting other groups to use it, but we've got churches in Eldora that don't even have pastors. I think there's 4 churches in Eldora that don't even have pastors anymore, including the Catholics. So it's just weird. I mean, the population drain from our area is immense. So it's hard to come up with solutions.
Yeah. Others? So let's turn with our last few minutes here. And I promised Catherine we'd come back to her question. How do we accelerate this? What's the accelerant we can pour onto this? And actually when you all go to your small groups, Enton and I basically have our little small group. That's just the 2 of us. And Enton, I would love it if you shared some of your thoughts, because you had that idea ready to go.
Yeah, there were 2 things we talked about, but the first thing I brought up, I would summarize with trust. And what it struck me is that if leadership can ask for permission from the congregation, if there's enough trust to say, we have, to use your opportunity language, Catherine, we have this opportunity, we really want to move on it. Do you trust us enough to allow us to really take this and run with it? Because with the other thing that Greg and I discussed was there are some cultures in congregations that are far more consensus model, but taken to the point where people who are given a responsibility aren't allowed to really even run with it. Greg's illustration was a witness commission that came up with a great idea, wanted to do it, but instead of them being able to say, this is witness commission, we can implement it, they have to take it back, and everyone has to be able to take it apart before there's the ability to move forward. And so it almost feels like each person has the right to micromanage everyone else's decision. And I've been part of congregations like that as well, and developing a culture where there's enough trust that you can say, okay, witness commission, this is your responsibility, you all go for it. Can also really help things move more quickly, because then a working group has the ability to make decisions and start implementing things and working towards opportunities. Greg, what would you add into that to flesh out what we had talked about even more?
Yeah, thanks, Ensign. And as I think about it, it does come back to one of the things I talked about earlier, which was not a totally organic bunny trail. I was thinking about it as I came into this tonight, which was this idea of leadership. And so what does it look like to not only take leadership, but also empower leadership in others in the congregation? Because most of our church structures depend on that. Like it's not just a nice idea. We actually say, hey, commission, we need you to do this work for us, and then come back to us with ideas and initiatives ready to go. So the example I was sharing was really interesting. It's not that uncommon. It's a very much in church dynamics, it's a family church structure, it's often called. And so everybody wants to feel like everybody is okay with things before they go ahead and do it. And sadly, what often happens, especially now, compounding this busyness we're talking about, is very practically in a meeting, you'll have a meeting where you send folks off, you send the witness commission off to have their meeting. They have their meeting, they come up with the idea, and then they come back, and then it all gets rehashed again. And so it's just multiplying the time that everybody's spending wearing people down. People then don't want to be part of the leadership group because it feels like kind of wasteful time at some point. So there's so many dynamics here, but I say an accelerant to Enton's point is trust and trust in leadership. How do we cultivate trust and show that transfer of trust? So if those of us who are pastors, I think the more we can say and encourage people, hey, you're the leader of this group. We need you, like we need you to lead, not just, and you know, you can encourage a lot too, but it can't be just you know, you can do it, you can do it. It has to be, we need you to do this. You've been called to something really important for this congregation. Let's do it. Go ahead, Enton.
Greg, you really described delegation of leadership as well, which takes you back to Lexi's ministry of all believers thing again. Is that, you know, the way we show that is to delegate leadership and say, okay, you get to run with it. It's yours.
So those are a couple, Catherine, those are a couple of accelerants, if you will. Another just more pragmatic thing that I'm thinking is, and this is kind of mechanical best practice, is to talk about things as a pilot project. Say, hey, if it's something that's uncomfortable for people, say, hey, why don't we try this for a month? And you know, that's one of the fears that people have, is if they, you know, sort of, if we give an inch, we'll take a mile. And so this notion of, why don't we try this for a month and see how it goes, and we'll come back to it. And that's really, that's sort of part of the, you know, I talked about in the descriptor, there were two change models. One is Lawson's model. The other is what I call the marathon model. It's not rocket science, right? So I do a lot of long distance running sorts of stuff. And the way you build, I started to realize that the way you build your body for any kind of long distance endeavor is the same way that you can build a congregation to become more pliable with change. So when you're training for a marathon, you might start, okay, I'm going to run 3 miles a day this week. And then on Saturday, I'm going to run 10 miles, right? So that becomes your high. And then I'm oversimplifying here, but on week 2, you're going to run 4 miles a day. And then on Saturday, you're going to run 12 miles. And so what you're doing is you're acclimatizing your body as you get stronger and stronger to tackle these longer and longer distances. And before you know it, you're running distances that you thought, I could not have imagined that I could run this far. And of course, on day 1, you could not have run that far. But as you've built your ability to do this over time, you start to build the strength. You build the strength and you build a sort of resilience in as well. And so there you go. A whole session in 2 minutes. But the pilot project is a way to, the pilot project is essentially one of those long weekend runs, right? We're going to try this for a month. It's going to stretch us out of our comfort zone. After a month, we're going to come back. And you may decide, you know what? So secret sauce here, right? People might be like, oh, this is good. We don't need to go back. And so, hey, all right, look what we just did. Or they might say, oh, we need to go back, but maybe we can do this like twice a year. Or maybe we can go back, but you know, the equivalent of going from 10 miles to 6 miles. And so you've made that progress. And just to keep doing that, that requires leadership. Again, it requires leadership. You need to be super intentional about how you do that, especially if you want to do that over the long term. If you see where our congregation is here and we really need to move way over here, then you start doing that. And there's some nuances. And again, I'd be glad to, anybody, please, I'll put my email in the chat. Unless, do people have my email address anywhere else, Enton? Okay, I'll put my email address in the chat and feel free to connect with me. I'd be glad to strategize with you a little bit about how you might do this in your congregation.
Catherine's calling that an opportunity, identifying an opportunity rather than a problem, puts a whole different mind, it makes my mind go a whole different way.
Say more.
Well, so what I was thinking of some for identifying of problems, I don't know quite how to say this, but it's not because we're the super duper evangelists of the world, but we have people moving here because of the retirement community that have great things to offer the church. And as I said, it isn't because we're such fabulous evangelists. It's just a place people want to live. And so, you know, there's 6 or 8 or 10 people that have moved here who have great things to bring to it. But my question is, what is the opportunity that we have then? And I look at little churches around us that are struggling. What is our opportunity to minister to the wider church? To share some of this talent that we have, some of this leadership. And I don't know, Catherine and I haven't talked about this, so I hate to be bringing it up here, so please forgive me. But you know, I see it as a tremendous opportunity to do something with it. What it is, I don't know.
Yeah, I would really, the most successful churches I see right now are churches who understand what opportunities they have, especially in terms of what they bring to a population. It could be a very specific population. So that's sort of what you're talking about there. I was also, I had an interesting conversation with the district executive a couple of months ago, and there's a very talented musician, worship leader, preacher in the Church of the Brethren who is wondering if there's a place where he can serve many congregations given this new Zoom reality, right? Given the fact that many smaller congregations don't have any of the means, you know, financial, time, otherwise, to have this kind of special music ministry, let's say. And we had kind of kicked around this idea when I was pastoring E-Town probably 4 years ago. And at that time, we got fairly strong pushback, both from the congregation, because we kind of felt like, oh, that's not how church works. But then also, I think, fair questions about, well, would anybody really want to do it, right? But they want to sort of pipe in somebody that they don't know, especially, again, like given our nature as Church of the Brethren people and very super highly relational. And I was having this conversation with this district executive, and they said, yeah, I think there is a moment for something like that now. I don't know that that's true. It's kind of spitballing, but it's interesting to think about how larger congregations can resource smaller congregations. And there's a new term that I've been hearing a lot, which is adoption of congregations. And so larger congregations adopting smaller congregations, and meaning sharing that mutual support and having it go both ways. So just a couple of interesting correlations there and different ideas that relate pretty directly. We're down to 1 minute. What do you got, Alice?
I was thinking of our house church in Minneapolis. They take turns doing the leadership for Sundays. They have a potluck meal, and they have discussion after in smaller, well, they're a smaller church, but it's a family situation. They bring their kids and everything. And so it's relational. It's a church of relations.
I want to thank you all for this time together. I appreciate your participation and your ideas. And I want to thank you for your leadership in the Church of the Brethren and your congregations. The fact that you're willing to give 3 hours on a Monday and Tuesday night in March says a lot to me about your level of commitment to the church. And so if there's anything I can do for any of you, I did put my email address in the chat. Feel free to reach out to me. I would love to connect with you all. And yes, thank you, Enton. Catherine threw that in there. Thank you, Enton, for all the hosting that you've done, and appreciate your participation as well. It's been phenomenal. That's what I've got tonight. Ensign, how else would you send us out?
Well, Greg, we want to thank you for leading us through this and sharing the wisdom that you have, and then also drawing upon our wisdom and weaving that all together. So thank you so much. If anyone wants to stay and talk to Greg for another few moments, he said he can be available to stick around for, 3 or 4 minutes after we conclude, but it's time. And so thank you all for coming to this course, and come back for some of our others. Go in peace. Thank you.
Blessings.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.